Okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order. It's 2 minutes after when we're supposed to start, but no time like the present to get the Corporate Services Committee meeting going. I'm going to read a statement first. City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternative formats and communication supports for council standing and advisory committee meetings and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. We have a fairly full agenda and a number of in-camera items. I'm going to proceed through the agenda in order. Is there any disclosures of pecuniary interest? Seeing none. With the consent items, I am aware of 2.1 and 2.2, which will be dealt with separately. Those are the capital and operating monitoring reports. 2.4, I was asked to deal with separately, which is remuneration. And I believe there's members here to talk about 2.8, which is a 1090 Hamilton Road. So that leaves 2.3, 2.5, 2.6, and 2.7. Would anybody like any of those dealt with separately? No? Then I'm going to prepare a motion for 2.3, 2.5, 2.6, and 2.7, and I'll look for a mover and a seconder for that. Councillor Helmer, Councillor Keabaga. Any discussion on those items? Okay, when that's ready. Oh, Councillor Helmer, we'll prepare the motion.
Yeah, just briefly on 2.7, I think it's wise to be moving ahead with that. I think this is an appropriate way of doing that. And I just wanted to say thanks to the staff for bringing that forward.
And that was the Western Fair Lands Agricultural or Archaeological Study. Sorry, I get Western Fair and Agricultural connected in my head. So, any other discussion? Seeing none, we'll open that for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 5-0.
The next two, 2.1 and 2.2 are both the capital monitoring report as well as the operating budget year-end monitoring report. I don't see any reason to deal with those separately, but what I did want them pulled for is, I believe this is the first time that colleagues have seen these reports, especially for new colleagues. They're important, but there's a lot going on in them. And so the treasurer and I, in consultation, thought it might be valuable for them to be introduced by the treasurer so you know exactly what's happening in these two reports because they come regularly to this particular committee. So I don't mind having a mover and seconder for them together. Unless people are looking for them dealt with separately. I do have someone who's interested in moving them together. So Councillor Keabaga, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer. So we'll put those up there on the floor now, and I'll look to our treasurer if she wants to provide some comments on exactly what's going on in the capital monitoring report, and then followed by the operating budget report, and then any questions colleagues have about these reports and what they do. We can certainly engage in that discussion.
Thank you. So through the chair, just to give a little bit of background, I'll start with the year-end capital monitoring first. So this report was essentially expanded in scope, and it was done through in connection with the actual development of the multi-year budget. So one of the key outcomes of the multi-year budget was that in subsequent years, because we were not developing the budget through the annual update process, and it gave us time to spend a lot more time and invest that time that we otherwise would have been doing budget into doing a lot more budget monitoring. And with the focus on looking at capital expenditures in particular, and looking at the budgets, the timelines, and particularly where capital projects had been beyond a certain date, looking at the status of them and trying to proactively close them so that we could release the funds that were no longer required, that could then be put back into the sources from which they came, so they would be available for uses for other capital items to come. So what you see through this report is that through all of the year-end monitoring, there are a number of projects that have been closed and are now ready to be finalized. So as a result, with the surplus in the projects that, through the detailed review, we are able to essentially take the net surplus funding from these capital, which is primarily through, there's a little bit of some of the pay-as-you-go capital receipts that we have, but a lot of it is through debt financing as well as reserve funds. So the amounts that are left over from the budgets can then be returned back to the reserve funds and be able to be authorized to offset debt that we would have otherwise issue in the future. So what that does is, over the long run, it gives us sources to finance additional projects in the future, as well as try to decrease the amount of debt which has already been authorized, which has significant savings to the taxpayer and keeps our debt payments low in the future. So some very, very positive outcomes through doing this work, and that's what created this very detailed report that you see before you today. So heading over into operating, essentially this is a detailed review of our actual financial position at the end of the year. So although we do monitoring twice a year, this is the final one, and at mid-year, we have a bit of a pretty good idea, but it's still early, it's 6 months into the process, so this is the final analysis of where we're going to be. So it allows us to take a good look at where we are. So based on our policy, because we do have a surplus, essentially what our surplus policy allows us to do is, there were some changes initially that we made in our reserve fund rationalization report in the fall of last year that gave the city treasurer a little bit of authority to move towards implementing over a long period of time, trying to put some, where we had the opportunity to, additional funds back into our contingency reserve funds so that we have a target that we've set that we have a very long-term plan to achieve, but this gave us the opportunity with the surplus to make a contribution to that, to offset some contingencies in the future that we might otherwise occur. And primarily working capital, one of our policies, the debt target, the target that we have for the contingencies is significantly higher than what we have today. So this has made a little bit of a dent in it, which is very helpful. But based on the policy, the remainder of the surplus essentially is recommended to go towards 50% to reduce debt, and then the remaining 50% is split between the Community Investment Reserve Fund as well as the Capital Infrastructure Reserve Fund. So the Community Investment Reserve Fund is the reserve fund that is supportive of, it's very broad, and that it allows council to provide direction on what that's used for, and I believe you've already used that for a few little projects to date. And then the Capital Infrastructure Reserve Fund is where the remainder goes to, and that, of course, helps offset our life cycle maintenance costs that we have significant pressure through our infrastructure gap, trying to close that and not allow it to get bigger over time. And the authorized debt, the $1.5 million, is, again, similar in concept to trying to reduce our authorized debt, will give us some additional debt capacity in the future, as well as maintain our debt payments in the future. So that, in a nutshell, is the reports. There's a lot of detailed analysis in terms of what's gone through, and a lot of information in a nutshell, so happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Great. Oh, Councillor Turner, welcome to the committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. If there are members of the committee that wish to speak before. Okay. Yesterday at the Planning and Environment Committee, we received a report, just an information report on annual report on building permit fees. In that there was a question of the balance and the drawdown on the Building Permit Stabilization Reserve Fund, and it alluded over to this part of the process in corporate services about reallocating about $925,370 in order to contribute to make sure that the Stabilization Reserve Fund maintained a balance that was 40% or above 40% of the expected amounts that it was supposed to cover through that year. So the question, I guess, that I have is why are we making the recommendation to do that rather than to actually draw off of the reserve fund itself to cover those overages? And use taxpayer levy funded dollars to support what is really supposed to be a fee-for-service recovery. Through you, Chair.
Yep. To the treasurer.
Thank you. Through the chair. So because we have an overall surplus overall, and notwithstanding the funding sources, one of the things that we do is we look at what the impact would be if we were to make that draw. So what that would end up doing would actually increase the amount of surplus that we have as a corporation, and would end up additionally applying it towards debt and applying it to the Community Investment Reserve Fund. And so from that perspective, we did not feel that it would make a lot of sense to create a bigger surplus, knowing, and what we understand is that this year will be there isn't a significant amount of funding in that reserve fund. And our feeling is that there could be potential additional draws required from it in 2019 that could potentially put it in a little bit of a precarious balance. So we didn't feel it was prudent to add to our surplus and distribute it accordingly to pay down debt, which is not the intent of it.
Anyone further? Go ahead, Councillor Van Meerbergen.
My question is, as most of us here know, when we get into the budget negotiations, budget time, and trying to find savings here, there, and everywhere, we're trying to scrimp and find this and find that. So we've gone through a tweaking of the 2018, and we find out that there's a surplus of 6 million. It kind of begs the question: at what point do we recognize or realize that perhaps the tax rate we're setting is too high to begin with?
To the treasurer.
Thank you. Through the chair. So one of the things that we have built in through the budget process, through the multi-year budget process, is a detailed review that we do on an ongoing basis. One of which is our service review targets. So we have $1 million that is built into the 2019 budget that we have to report out on in September of every year, that we have to identify where those savings are going to come from. So certainly that is one thing that we very carefully analyze, what is here and where we have achieved surpluses, to see if there is anything that we can use that would be an ongoing saving that would help contribute towards that $1 million first, because that has to be found, because that's already been reduced as part of the budget. The secondary thing is also looking at that to see if there are other amendments that need to be found. So one of the very detailed things we look at is exactly what is contributing to the surplus. The majority of the items in the surplus are very one-time in nature. So if they are not ongoing, by reducing the budget for something that is a one-time draw would actually result in a potentially higher tax rate the following year if it doesn't materialize again. So that is part of the analysis. So we know that we have $1 million already. So one of the things we will be carefully scrutinizing, and that we've already identified small pieces towards achieving that target, is there anything else in here that is definitely going to help contribute to that? If there is anything further, it would certainly be something that would help us offset future budgets, but only with respect to what would be an ongoing item. So that is definitely part of our review and something that we take quite strongly to see if there's a reduction that is appropriate in the future.
Sure, go ahead.
Follow up. So in your experience, how often are surpluses realized when property tax rates are set? Like, is it every other year, every third year? Just roughly.
So through the chair, we have been very fortunate as the City of London, through our very detailed monitoring and planning, that we have not had a deficit in as long as I can remember. It's been quite some time. So we're looking at a significant number of years. However, what I would caution is that we're roughly looking at approximately not a lot more than 1% of our entire budget. So although it may seem significant, we are in fact not that far off from a budget as significant as the size that the City of London has. So it might seem significant in terms of real dollars, but this is also all of the boards and commissions as well. And so when you look at what potentially could be ongoing, one of the things we do know is the personnel, and we certainly look at that. What I can tell you is that a lot of that surplus truly is one-time in nature. We had a very significant challenge hiring staff for positions for which we were budgeted, which contributed to that. And that's certainly something that we've been down staff in a number of areas, and it's a challenge to continue service delivery when you have positions that you know you need to fill and you're having a hard time filling them. So we've done a very in-depth analysis, and a lot of the money that's there is truly one-time in nature, although we have seen certain patterns that we're experiencing that we're looking at how we can address in the long term.
Yeah, okay, but my question though is, in terms of surpluses, how, is there a pattern that you see, or does it repeat itself every third year, every second year? Like, take for example, the last 10 years, how often did we have a surplus?
So my apologies if I wasn't clear through the chair. We have not had a deficit overall for a very significant number of years. So we're, at least for the last 10 years, I believe, we have had a surplus to varied degrees. And what I would say is the items that have contributed to them have generally been quite different. There's been a little portion that's always with respect to personnel, but the reasoning behind it is not always the same. And snow plowing, I think, was a very good example. Overall, we have a surplus, but at mid-year, we knew we had a significant deficit. We did not know, of course, what the last half of the year would bring. So overall, the city has had a surplus. That's a good news story, because if we have a deficit, we have to raise that through the rates the following year, and we have contingencies built in for that. So I would say we have had a surplus. That is a good story. That has helped us contribute to some of the pilot initiatives that we've been able to achieve over time and help pay down our debt, and through our surplus policy have allocated it accordingly.
Go ahead.
But there's this, and I'm sure you appreciate this, like there's this tension that goes with every budget cycle between giving the minimal increase to those taxpayers out there and being able to fund what we need to fund. And so when we see surpluses repeating, I think we have to be very careful. I take your point that, you know, given the size of the budget, perhaps in a percentage level, but it's still millions of dollars, that we have to be careful that we set it so that we can keep that minimal increase. So that's what I'm trying to, that's the point I'm trying to make. So again, if over the last 10 years, did we have 5 surpluses, 6 surpluses? Like, can you comment on that?
Go ahead.
Through the chair, at least 10 that I am aware of. I don't have, I can provide that information at council. I don't have that right in front of me, but we have deliberately tried to ensure that we do not deficit. So, because that would have a detrimental impact, and we would adjust accordingly if we felt we were going to deficit.
Okay, I just, again, wanted to make that point that we do want to try and come to the people with a minimal rate and not give them a higher rate than necessary. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Further comments on this? If not, I have a comment. Oh, sorry, Councillor Turner.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Chair, I did want to come back to the contingency reserve, or the stabilization reserve. I do have a lot of concerns. I wasn't prepared for the answer from the treasurer on this. Really what we're doing in operation here is stabilizing a stabilization reserve by using levy funds to stabilize a user pay reserve fund. To the tune of $1 million. I mean, it's not a trivial amount. I recognize that our policy provides the treasurer designate the ability to do housekeeping adjustments within the report. I guess I'd argue that $1 million is beyond housekeeping, that this is a pretty massive contribution of public funds to what is a fee for service. So to give a summary of what's happening here is there, building permits are drawn. There's an administrative costs that are associated with building permits. And this year there was a deficit of about just short of $1 million in the total costs of operating costs versus the amount that we received in revenues. In order to make sure that from year to year that's not a challenge, there's a stabilization reserve fund that was established, and when there's a year of surplus, money goes into the reserve fund, and when there's years of deficit, it's supposed to be drawn from the reserve fund. What's proposed here is that the money isn't drawn from the reserve fund, but rather contributed by taxpayers to the tune of $1 million. So when we go through the budget, $1 million is not an immaterial amount. And the drawdown on, so there's a range of what both the industry and staff have determined would be comfortable to have in terms of a balance on that reserve. And it's between, I think, between 30 and 50%. So if we were to do the $1 million drawdown off of that reserve, it would bring it down to 25.6% of the annual operating cost, which is small. I mean, it gets us into a position where we don't have a lot of money to cover future deficits that might occur in the building permit operations. But there is also an agreement that when the reserve falls below 30% of the annual cost, a review would be undertaken with a view to increasing the permit fees so that these costs aren't borne by taxpayers. They're borne by industry who are developing and pulling building permits. This isn't something that the taxpayers should be paying for. Growth should be paying for growth. And so when we do a contribution of $1 million to this reserve fund, we're getting a long ways away from growth paying for growth. And the opportunity cost of that $1 million going towards reducing issued but authorized but unissued debt, those kind of things, we start to lose those potential. And instead, in subsequent years, we have to charge more in property taxes. So when I read this in the Planning Committee agenda for yesterday, and then I saw this item coming up in corporate services. You notice I don't come to corporate services very often, but this was something that was enough of a concern for me that I thought this needs to be addressed by council. And I would ask the committee to take some more action with this, whether that's referring it back to staff, whether it ultimately I think it does reside within the discretion of the treasurer on how to go about this, but I'm not convinced that this is the best action forward for what is supposed to be fee for service and user recovery rather than taxpayer recovery. So I did want to raise that for your attention because I really think it's an important issue.
Councillor Helmer.
Thank you, and appreciate Councillor Turner raising the issue, perhaps through the chair to our staff. Certainly there's a wide range of financial needs across the organization. The Building Permit Stabilization Reserve Fund is one. Councillor Turner seems quite reluctant to have the property tax covering the subsidy for this particular year. And certainly this is an issue that we've had in previous years. Colleagues will recall that in the 2 years before this one, there are actually large surpluses in the building area because we had record levels of building construction happening. And a lot of money was contributed to the reserve from the building area. I think in 2016 it was $1.7 million. So we've got a substantial reserve. And if you look back over the last 5-year period, it's roughly balanced, you know, in terms of contributions and what would have been withdrawals from the reserve. But in all the years where there would have been withdrawals, taxpayers covered the difference. So going back all the way back to 2005, it's somewhere in the order of $3 million, just over $3 million when you roll in this $925,000. So it certainly adds up over time, all these taxpayer contributions. And this is usually how it is handled. If there's a year where we have a slightly higher surplus and there's also a deficit in the building area and the reserve fund balance is low, then, you know, monies are contributed to kind of top it up. But it certainly never comes in the other direction. So that's never really resolved. And I think it is becoming a bit of an issue. So in terms of what Councillor Turner is talking about, if we weren't to contribute this to the Building Permit Stabilization Reserve, we certainly would have a balance on the low end of what is the range now. I know that there are changes coming to the billing fees, and I wonder, I see Mr. Kotsvis in the back, and I wonder if he just wants to speak directly to what the sort of future outlook is for this area with the fee changes that are being contemplated, and whether, as Ms. Barbone mentioned, we might have another deficit, upon us soon, or perhaps not, depending on what happens. So I wonder if we could just deal with that issue now. I realize it's not planning committee, but since we're talking about it, I wonder if we could hear from Mr. Kotsvis.
We certainly could, and Mr. Kosoff is prepared to speak.
Through the chair, sorry, I'm not feeling too good, but try to get through this with my voice. Yes, Councillor Helmer is absolutely right. It's been an up and down draw and contribution to the reserve. The reserve has always been set arbitrarily at a target, and that was something that was established way back in the day with the industry. It has been dangerously low in some circumstances and moderately available in others, and the economy really drives the need to actually either contribute or draw from the reserve. The legislation is such that it doesn't preclude you from subsidizing, if you will, the building permit reserve. What it does preclude you from doing is actually utilizing any excess money for other purposes other than its intended use, which is the administration and enforcement of the Act. In terms of the fund itself, we've always believed that this arbitrary level of funding that's available, which is set between 30 and 50% of our operating funds, has always been low. And when we had the economic downturn, for those that were here, we really were hit quite hard. And so again, it's very economically driven. We've now want to establish a target at a much higher rate at about 100%. And that was a report that went last night to PEC. And we were looking at increasing our fees. We've met with the industry on this a number of times with the various stakeholders to advise them, and they seem supportive. We will be bringing that forward at a new future PPM, but the fees are to be increased dramatically to hopefully avoid this from happening in the future. Part of the problem, though, is those fees will not be into effect till sometime later this year. So my nervousness is that we may have to dip into this again for next year, and if we draw now and then draw again, there will be nothing left.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I think that's helpful context. In 2013, for example, the balance in the reserve fund was cratering out at sort of like 13%, right, of what the costs were. So it was very low. The reason I bring that up is because we're not in that situation anymore. I think that's important. Yeah, I can hear what Mr. Kotsvis is saying, that we need to have some kind of buffer. It has been really low in the past, and at those times I think I would have supported the contributions to the reserve. But now that we're at a point where it's 40% of the balance, even if we were to run a deficit this year and we were to run one next year, we still wouldn't probably be as bad as we were a couple of years ago in terms of the balance of the reserve fund. And I think we're finally fixing the root of the problem, which is the fees need to increase. And so, this is a cost recovery service. It's supposed to be that way. Even when we look at the fees, it's not as though every single cost is being covered by the fees. There's still some subsidies coming from property taxpayers into that area anyway. And I am a bit reluctant to be putting in this kind of quantum. And I wonder, through the chair to the treasurer, if it wasn't going into the building permit stabilization reserve, certainly we could have it go through the surplus deficit policy, but are there other pressing financial needs where you say, well, before we do that, perhaps there's something else that we need to top up a reserve fund that has got a lot of other demands on it?
To the treasurer.
Through the chair, the pressing item was the contribution to the contingency, which we've put a $3 million towards. And the other item was specifically the reserve fund for the industrial DC, which we've also accomplished. So I would say from a pressing need, we've addressed the most pressing needs, and I would follow policy for the remainder.
Further comments on this? I'm going to make some general comments on surplus from the chair, based on some of the discussion, irrespective of the conversation that was just had. I do want to say that surpluses are a very normal thing and a very good thing, especially when they're the size that they are compared to the size of the budget. You certainly don't want to be in a situation where you're not collecting enough taxes to meet the needs and the services and demands that the community has on the municipality. And I will say the general provisions of our surplus and deficit policy actually do return a lot of value to taxpayers at the end of the day, because we put money into reducing unauthorized debt. We put them into a capital infrastructure gap reserve fund, and we put some into community investment reserve fund, which allows for new and innovative investments in the community. Because we've been putting money towards those things, we have led to a significant reduction in the debt that the city has, not just through this, but through other contributions against the debt. And that has led to savings for taxpayers through reduced debt servicing payments. And so when we have surpluses, I do believe that we're using them on the whole by policy responsibly, and are returning that value back to taxpayers in a responsible way. And I think that is a situation where we can provide enough of a buffer, a reasonable sized buffer at less than 1% of the operating budget, which means our treasurer is doing an excellent job of budgeting very accurately over the course of a year and ensuring that there is enough space in there to meet unexpected demands without having to come back with a deficit position. And then allowing that excess to go through a policy that actually returns a lot of value for the residents of London. So I'm pretty comfortable with the general provisions of our policy, and I wanted to make those comments given some of the discussions that we had on surplus in general. Are there other colleagues who have other questions? Otherwise, I have this currently moved and seconded, and currently it is both items 2.1 and 2.2. So I'll look for further discussion. Okay, seeing none, I can open that for voting then.
Councillor Van Meerbergen?
I vote yes.
Thank you. Closing the vote. The motion's passed 6-0.
Okay, thank you. The next item is 2.4, elected officials and appointed citizen members 2019 remuneration. I'd look for any comments or questions on that. If not, I'll look for a mover and a seconder. Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Sorry, Chair, I just want to confirm this is 2.4?
That's correct.
Yeah, so my comments on this are simply, and I think it would be similar to some on council, that we all know that things were rearranged and an increase was given in 2018 already. Certainly in dollar amount, it appears significant. It is after taxation, you can make the case, but whatever. The point is that happened. And then to have this additional increase on top of that for this year, I think isn't the right way to go. I think we should not vote in favor of this for this particular year. I mean, particularly in the private sector, this notion that these increases just automatically go forward all the time isn't there. There's a number of people who have jobs in London who don't get this. And again, given the fact that we've had an increase and then to have another one on top sends all the wrong messages. So I'll be voting against this.
Further comments? Mayor Holder.
Thank you very much. I was not part of council when the decision was made to move the salary level of councillors to a full-time level based on the median average. And that was beyond the 1/3 tax-free portion that all members of council, including the mayor, participated in at that time. So there were two increments for councillors. One was not an increment, it was the net take-home impact of removing the tax-free portion. And that was dollars neutral, frankly, certainly from the standpoint of remuneration. The second part, though, was the issue of the increment to move to that median average of full-time Londoners. All to say that when that was done, the effective date of that was late in the year. And I couldn't imagine the council would have imagined that there should be what now would ultimately become a retroactive increase based on the CPI. And so as a result of that, it strikes me as a double hit. I would be surprised if councillors would support this. That'll be every councillor can make their decision on this. Something a little different from Councillor Van Meerbergen, to have something that's automatic in there. I'm not offended by that. That would not be any different from any negotiated contract that we would have, say, with our various union groups. But the notion of doing it so quickly after the first, the large increment was put in place, what I would deem to be large, I think is distasteful, and I don't think is appropriate. So I will not be supporting it.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just give some context on why the councillor stipends were set the way they were and what happened from the Council Compensation Review Task Force was to tie the council stipend with an index. And in the base rate, it was based on Statistics Canada identification of the average full-time wage, mean full-time wage of Londoners. And that is calculated once every 5 years during the census. So in addition to that, there needs to be something to index it against, and that was CPI. So the base is based on the past census, so the base amount was identified from a couple of years ago when the census was done. It's not based on a current amount, and it gets adjusted by the CPI. Back when we had the discussion, I voted against the increase because I thought it was kind of a half measure. You either do it or you don't. And this was landing someplace in between. But the concept of creating an index by which the council compensation should be tied is one that I strongly agree with, and I think it's kind of risky to deviate from that. What this helps us do is not decide what our own compensation is. This is a challenge that will be faced by councillors forever because we have to, we're legislated to set the amount of compensation for councillors. We can do whatever we want with it. We can go up, we can go down, we can freeze where we are, but we still have to deal with it. And it's a politically messy thing to do, always. And there's a tendency to say, no, we're not going to do anything with it because of the optics of it. But that's not an appropriate way to address this on the optics basis. The rationale for tying this to an index was so that we wouldn't be mired with the optics question, so that we could have some objective measure by which to tie council compensation, and it could be clearly identified on a year-to-year basis. And that's what's being brought forward here. So I really encourage you to support what's being proposed. I think it's quite appropriate. I would disagree with the comment that it's distasteful. I think the reason for and the rationale for this being brought forward by an independent group of citizens that until recently nobody had ever listened to, because we kept striking the Council Compensation Task Force and never listening to the recommendations. This is the first time. And so, one, by not taking that, we undermine the process of going to citizens and asking for recommendations and then not adopting them. And so what faith does the community have next time we go and ask them to do a council compensation task force or something similar? And two, how do we ever get out of this hole of the optics not being good enough to be able to either approve any changes to our compensation? So I really encourage you to take the recommendation in the report as it's put forward here, because I think it's quite appropriate and it's reasoned, it's well measured, and it's tied to the economy. It's tied to the forces that affect every Londoner on a daily basis. And their economy will be, or their position in the economy will be based on the economy that we help to grow for them as well. Thanks.
Mayor Holder.
Thank you, Chair. What is distasteful is the notion that a very significant increase was beyond the tax-free component was put in place to the median full-time wage level for council, so butted up so close to the January 1st, if you will, effective date of the CPI. I don't know, again, not having been on council, if on reflection, the compensation committee might have thought to defer it because of the proximity between the increase that was put in place and this retroactive wage increase. That's the part that I'm extremely uncomfortable with, and hence won't be supporting it. What I indicated before was, I think, and I'll speak to Councillor Turner's comments, which I think are fair, that there has to be some process by which we don't annually beat ourselves to death on the issue of compensation once a year. But I think that this particular time and timing just does not work for me, which is why I'll be not supporting it.
Other comments? Councillor Helmer. Sorry, I'll just take down names. It's just flagged for me.
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe my least favorite topic to discuss. I don't know. There's some other ones that might be in the running too, but so I just want to put it in context. We're talking about $19,000, right, between the mayor's increase that's being proposed and the councilor's increase. I don't want us to lose track of the fact that we're also talking about the remuneration for all the citizen appointees to boards and commissions, some of whom receive stipends. So it's not just pay for ourselves. I think we need to reframe sort of what we've had as a discussion so far. So the council compensation task force was struck early on in the last term of council. And what they recommended is that the median income be set at the 2016 full-time median income. And then council decided to delay implementation of that until the start of the next council. Now, I supported that. I think that those were both the right decision. Base it on the full-time median income. I think that's appropriate. The only number we had for that was from 2016, and make it effective in 2018. So the reason it started in December is because we delayed it, right? So we delayed the increase. It kind of sounds like it's like, oh, look, these two increases are so close together, when in fact, what's happened is that there was no increase for a very long period of time. And in fact, all of these normal increases that would have happened by policy, we did not take while the compensation task force was underway. So 0, compensation task force recommends 2016 median income. That is delayed, then it gets implemented. Now we're finally coming back to actually following the policy, which is every year just increase it by CPI, which I think is also very reasonable. So yeah, it doesn't look good to have an increase in December and then another increase that's retroactive back to January. There's no way out of that, right? Is the idea that we're not supposed to have salary increases for 2019, that neither the mayor nor councillors nor any of the citizen appointees to boards and commissions should get salary increases for 2019? My view is that the more people who are getting salary increases in society, the better, generally speaking. And I think it's fair and reasonable that councillors and all kinds of other staff and people who do work should get increases. So, you know, when I've worked in the private sector, I think I got an increase every year. So that's, you know, pretty common, at least in my experience. I think that's what people want. Their costs are certainly going up. And so people are looking after those things. I think we have to be fair about how we're doing council compensation. It's very difficult to come up with a way that's gonna work. I think this is the best of all the options I've seen in terms of have some way to judge what it should be set at, increment it slowly over time. If we just keep foregoing increases, when the adjustment happens to full-time median income, it's going to seem like a huge increase, when in fact it shouldn't be. It's just a series of steady, small increases. So I would encourage my colleagues to support this particular recommendation. I do think when it comes to the policy, potentially having some kind of relationship to the other unionized bargaining agreements that we have, to say, we'll take CPI or the lowest of whatever's been bargained for that year among all the groups. You know, that might be a more appropriate way of setting it up. I don't want to make that change right now. I think that's a policy change we should talk about if that's something we want to consider. But I do think that that maybe is a better way of handling it. We're in the situation here where inflation is quite a bit higher than it has been in the past. A lot of the collective agreements are probably lagging that expectation. And so this one is coming in a bit higher than what we're seeing in a lot of the collective agreements, which I think is sending not a good message to the employee groups who are working at the city. So I don't think we should forego it. We've done that in the past. What ends up happening is a big increase later because the problem of people should have reasonable increases in compensation to keep up with the cost of living, that remains, regardless of how we make the decisions around compensation. So I'm going to support this one. We did pass during the last term of council that we would continue this policy. And I remember who voted for what on that. Like that was a specific part of the recommendation was to continue this practice. So we did it to ourselves.
Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And through you to my colleagues, I think I could have said a number of the things that Deputy Mayor Helmer just suggested, but point out one thing is that if we had been choosing the 2018 median income and then a couple months into 2019 made the increase, then I think that would have been maybe as distasteful as the mayor had suggested. But this is really the 2016. So you can imagine that we're actually behind a couple of increases, if you want, and we put ourselves back that way. So I don't see this as distasteful. The amount of 2.3% is less than that's the CPI for Ontario. The labor amount was 3.2, so this is less. The reason I bring this number up is if we were to do this increase every year for 5 years, as Councillor Turner pointed out, we find out what the median income is every 5 years. But at 2.3%, that's about a 12% change compounded over 5 years. If we voted this down every 5 years because we thought it was distasteful, then as Deputy Mayor Helmer suggested, we would have that 12% difference, and then we'd be stuck in this place where, well, we know we were supposed to be having the median income, but now it's a 12% difference. Then people are going to say, well, how can you give yourself a 12% raise when nobody else in the public sector gets a 12% raise? And of course, the justification would be that, well, we didn't give ourselves a raise for 5 years, but it just seems awkward. So this is awkward no matter what, but it's not as bad as, say, I know London Hydro, the board of directors, there's another situation where for many, many years that we just gave them no increase, not even a raise such as this one. And they got so far behind that those directors are paid less than the smallest utility in Ontario. And so that's because we've waited so long that you get this huge gap that's produced. So I think it's probably better to follow this policy and go with those small increases. And then in a couple years, when we get the new median income, we'll just adjust it to that. And it might go up a little bit or down a little bit, but it won't be a big change, and it won't be a big concern. So I think this keeps things to a minimum in terms of controversy. So it's probably the best thing to do is just support this. And our median income will adjust itself every 5 years, and we don't really have to worry about it.
I have other people on the speakers list, but I also don't have a mover and a seconder for this particular item, so maybe we'll go with that. Councillor Helmer, seconder. Councillor Keabaga. Okay, Councillor Hillier.
Yes, I'm reading the recommendation here. Remuneration for elected officials and appointed citizen committees. Through the chair, I'd like to know how many citizen members and how big that stipend is?
Well, there's various citizen appointees of different levels of stipends, but I think our staff can give you some general comments on that. They might not be able to, I don't know if you want them to articulate every individual position and their stipend, but yeah, we'll go with that.
Through the committee chair to committee, the impact of providing the 2.3% increase to those appointed members would be approximately in totality about $1,000 in total. That gives that response to the councillor's question.
Anything further? Are you okay? All right. Any further comments? Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for recognizing me at your committee. I just want to go back to something that Councillor Turner said about the task force. So this was a task force that that the previous council convened, and I believe the membership was pretty similar to the task force that had been convened during the 2010-2014. No, not the same. Some members were the same, were they not? I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, go ahead.
No, it was actually a very different membership. The previous membership had certain representatives from certain organizations and institutions across the city. The most recent task force was basically appointed by us, but basically all of the individuals were recommended and chosen by the clerk.
Great, thank you for that clarification. So I do remember that it was a task force of volunteer citizens, but I also remember they did very extensive public engagement. It wasn't just like a handful of individuals that made some decisions and brainstormed amongst themselves. It took them many months to prepare their final report and present it to council. And again, they did very extensive public engagement. The previous council for the entire 4 years did not take an increase at all over those 4 years. There was a recognition by the task force and by the citizens that participated in their public engagement that the work of a city councillor had become much more complex, much demanded a greater amount of time. Now, every individual councillor in the end decides how much they want to work, how hard they want to work, and how much time they want to put in. But in general, the task force and the group of citizens that participated recognized that basically this is a board of directors for $1 billion corporation. And there are a certain amount of responsibilities that go with that. At the same time, there was recognition that nobody should be looking to gain personal wealth by serving on city council. It is public service. And so they, I believe, struck an appropriate balance there, especially in tying the compensation to the median income, full-time income in the City of London. So as Councillor Turner mentioned, based on the economy and how it's running in the City of London, that determines the rate of pay or the stipend for the councillor. I actually voted against the recommendation of the task force, not the policy, not the ongoing policy of the minor increases over the years, but I voted against the one-time lump sum increase. I felt that we should have phased it in. That said, as other councillors have mentioned, it's never going to be an easy conversation to have. I reluctantly put my hand up. Kind of was hoping the chair might not even see it. But it's a conversation that we have to have by law. And we also have to consider a couple of other things. The quality of people that put their name forward to run for city council and the barriers that we may be putting up. So when we keep the stipend so low, and also when you consider the responsibility that is so large for a city councillor, when you have that combination, are we putting up barriers to certain people who could serve, who would be willing to serve, and whose voices should be heard around this horseshoe? Are we, if we were to keep the stipend artificially low as we had for decades, are we saying to certain people, unless you have a certain level of personal wealth, then you're not allowed to sit around this table. Your voice isn't welcome here. So we have to really be careful about that. And I think we run the risk whenever we freeze the stipend and not look at increases such as this one that's being recommended. We run the risk of years down the road being in that same situation that we found ourselves in the last term, where the compensation had been frozen at a low level compared to other municipalities of the size of London. So I support the policy. I support going forward. This is the first little blip where the two increases are really close together. And I think we just need to get over that blip and let the policy work the way it was intended to work. And the way citizens involved in the public engagement told us that we should allow this to work this way.
Further comments by colleagues on this? I'll just make some brief ones from the chair. Certainly I appreciate all the comments that have been made. I understand the sensitivity of the proximity of the increase. I can tell you my personal preference on this is to approve the citizen increases, forgo the councillor increases for 1 year, return to the policy next year because of the proximity. I understand that will create a blip down the road when there's a correction or a potential correction, because one of the other things that the Citizen Task Force recommended is that we actually review the process and a number of things again. And I recognize that they recommended to keep this process in play. I'm comfortable with this process, but I think I'm also comfortable delaying it for 1 year if that is a compromise position that puts the councillors in the community in the same spot. I don't have any interest in delaying the citizen appointee increases, but that's not the particular motion on the floor. So I'd be happy to move something alternative if this one fails. But that's where my position is on this. And mine is based both on my previous votes, listening to the task force, as well as how I engaged with people at the doors over the last election. Any other discussions? Councillor Helmer.
Just one thing I wanted to add to the discussion before we vote. Back in October, this is just before the election, we had a discussion about compensation. We were dealing with this 1/3 allowance issue, and we were finally resolving that. And unfortunately, because of the focus of the Council Compensation Task Force, the mayor's salary had just been kind of ignored. And so what we were facing at that time was that the mayor's salary was going to stay the same, $106,000. That was with the 1/3 tax exemption. So if we hadn't done anything, it just would have been a pay cut, right? So the take-home pay would have gone down substantially. And we had a debate about that. This is, I don't know, this is like 2 weeks before the election or something. Not exactly the best time to be talking about an issue like that, I have to tell you. And at that time, I said, look, I want to do the right thing, right? The right thing is to keep this pay the same after this federal change happens. And we had a vote on that, and it went through 7-5. A bunch of people didn't support it. Said, this is not right. You shouldn't be changing it. It's not the right time. I mean, they had their reasons for not supporting it. But when it comes to these issues, I mean, I'm not going to start with, what is the most politically popular thing to do? I'm just not. That can't be the primary consideration when you're dealing with something like compensation for people, any kind of employee group. So what's fair to people? What's good in the long term? What's going to create the kind of incentive structure that we want around council compensation? Not any given year, what's going on with the specifics. This is the fairest policy I've ever seen. Until somebody is going to put something in front of me that's a better policy framework, that's actually going to handle this in a better way in the long term, I'm gonna keep supporting it, even when inflation happens to be slightly higher, even when the timing is coincidentally unfortunate. And I think in retrospect, you know, I don't know if we could have done this, but we should have just said this plus, you know, whatever the inflation rate is, we don't even know what it is yet. And maybe that would have been the easier way of handling it. I think we did the right thing by deferring the compensation increase for so long. And the amount of money that we saved from that is more than enough to pay for this, you know, like, so even on a net basis, we're way ahead, having deferred the compensation, even just the median income base year being 2016. So from a financial perspective, I think it makes sense. From a long-term perspective, I think this makes sense. I hope people will support it, because otherwise we're gonna be doing this like all the time, you know?
Further discussion? Okay, seeing none, we can open that for voting. And this is on the staff recommendation in the report.
Closing the vote, the motion's lost, 3-3.
So that's a non-decision. I mentioned during the debate that I'd be willing to put something alternative on the floor. I'm not sure if it'll pass, but I should hand the chair over to our vice chair, Councillor Kayabaga, to be able to do that. We don't have to switch positions if you don't like, but if you could chair the meeting so I can propose an alternate motion.
Councillor Chair Morgan.
Okay, so I'll suggest, and the clerk has some language around this, that basically that we take no action on the 2019 councillor compensation, but that we authorize the citizen compensation increase as articulated in the report. So I'd be happy to move that if there's a seconder.
Mayor Holder. So moved by Councillor Morgan and seconded by Mayor Holder. Call to vote. So we'll take questions or comments. Deputy Helmer.
Yeah, I think 2.3% is the cost of living increase, so I think it's appropriate. I'd encourage my colleagues to support it.
Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, we'll call to vote. Deputy Helmer.
Sorry, in case it wasn't clear, I would like those to be separated. Thank you.
So we'll call to question part A.
Closing the vote, and the Part A passes 4-2.
And we'll call to vote, to question Part B.
Closing the vote, and the motion for Part B is carried 6-0.
I hand the chair back to Councillor Morgan.
Thank you, Councillor Kayabaga. The next item on our list is 2.8, which is a development charges deferred payment agreement for Italian Seniors Project at 1090 Hamilton Road. I'm not sure who wanted to talk about that one, but I was asked to pull it separately. My apologies, I didn't bring those notes with me. Oh, and I should note there's a revised page on the added agenda. It's basically a change to just one section of it. So the motion and debate that we'll be having actually reflects those changes in it. So we don't need to take any action on that. If someone's willing to move this, we could just move the whole thing. Councillor Helmer, you're willing to move it? Seconder? Mayor Holder? Discussion. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I think in the circumstances that this is appropriate, so I'm happy to move it and support it. I just wonder through the chair to our staff, this is not a totally uncommon situation. Do we think we're going to be dealing with more of these in the future when people are trying to access different levels of funding and they have timing issues in the execution of those agreements?
Mr. Yeoman.
Through you, Mr. Chair, this is definitely a fairly unique situation. To my knowledge, the city has never actually done a deferred payment agreement for development charges. It is provided under the Development Charges Act, and that's why it's before you here. We have explored a lot of options internally with the development proponents of whether or not they could phase their development for the payment of DCs and whether there's some interpretation to the DC bylaw that might be available. We exhausted all options and landed at this as the only one that's viable to ensure the project can actually materialize as it goes forward. What I will say is we do have an item number C here, asking that you direct us to prepare a policy related to these matters. We think that's incredibly important going forward. There may be a possibility that you'll be seeing more of these in the future, and we want to make sure that council's prepared for criteria and policies that can be applied for these applications as they do come in.
Councillor Helmer.
I look forward to that. The reason I'm asking about it is because although I would support this kind of deferred payment agreement in certain circumstances and for specific purposes, I don't think it's generally a good idea, and I don't want people to get the wrong idea that this is going to become a common practice for all kinds of developers doing all kinds of projects. So I look forward to the policy coming forward, and hopefully it's quick because this kind of news can spread, and I don't want people to have the wrong idea.
Further comments from the committee? No? Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much. I think this is a great project that we should encourage to go forward. And the proponents that I was speaking with on the weekend, actually, in a social occasion, were describing how they're kind of stuck in a chicken and egg situation where in order to get their funding to pay for the development charges, they need a building permit, but they can't have a building permit until we give them development charges. So this is a kind of an elegant solution to deal with that. It doesn't harm the city at all. And as a matter of fact, this may be a way for us to encourage nonprofits like this one to help us increase the affordable housing stock. because it might be a challenge that's faced in the future, which is also great why we're coming up with a policy. Because one of the questions we've asked in the past is, what can we do to help with affordable housing being built in the city? And this may be one of those things. So it'll be good to see how this works out. And thank you to the HDC and to the proponents for working on this project. It's across from the Residencia Italia, and I think a lot of people will appreciate the new home that they will have in the Hamilton Road area.
Thank you, Councillor. Further discussion? Seeing none, we'll open this one for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0.
Thank you. The next, there's no scheduled items. We have items for direction. Item 4.1, council member expense account policy. We have a letter from our colleague, Councillor Pelosa, who's in attendance at the committee today. If the committee doesn't mind, I think I'd start with letting Councillor Pelosa comment on her letter and what she'd like the committee to consider, and then after that I would look for either comments and questions from the committee of Councillor Pelosa through the chair, or you're welcome to move any sort of motion that you feel is appropriate based on what the councillor's asking. So Councillor Pelosa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the committee for recognizing a committee that is not mine and for seeing this motion before you. My understanding is that this motion has to go through you as direction to the governance working group, which is currently doing a review of our councillor members' expense policy. Within that review, I am requesting home internet be reviewed in that. The motion before you reads that it be the removal of this claimable expense. Recognizing last year it was $1,750, certainly not a large amount in past years. In 2016, it was $4,000, recognizing it's an annual expense that is on the books. I'm certainly welcoming to hear my colleagues' concerns, if it maybe is regarding a cap if they see fit, recognizing as Councillor Cassidy raised earlier about anything we do, making sure that's not a barrier to serving in the position, that we all have equal access around the horseshoe, and waiting to see if it's standard amongst our municipalities of what actually is claimable and what's happening. That's where this motion came from. And recognizing that most of us do have internet at home, either a basic package or unlimited if we have kids who are using a lot of streaming services. So looking for that conversation, just even be brought to governance and then back to us as part of their package.
Any comments from colleagues? Mayor Holder.
Thanks very much, Chair. I've heard some numbers about how material this particular issue is in terms of whether councillors are using this and deducting it accordingly. But would it not be, this is just a question through you, Chair, would it not be the purview of the governance working group to include any consideration of what is within the current members' expense review to look, I'm trying to get a sense of, does this require a separate motion that the governance working group just couldn't deal with that as just part of their review of the members' expense policy? I'm just trying to get a feel for that, if you might be able to help.
Well, despite being chair of the governance working group, I don't remember every authorization the committee was given, but I would suspect, and I'm hoping I can turn to Councillor Pelosa to see if she had comments with the clerk about the appropriate place to land this, because I believe her original intent was to go to the governance working group, but she received some advice to come here. So maybe Councillor Pelosa, if you could assist.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. And yes, originally I thought of just taking this to the governance working group, and our clerk directed me back here to go through you to get it to there. So unfortunately, you get it here as well, Mr. Chair.
So back to the mayor, it would seem to me, based on that, that the ability and scope of our review of councillor expenses, if I recall correctly, is limited to what we're tasked with. And the reason why we're talking about it at all is because of a motion that Corporate Services directed to the governance working group that Councillor Van Holst brought forward on some potential changes to the expenses. But I don't think it is, the scope is unlimited. So if you're considering us, giving the governance working group a greater scope to look at the expense policy and maybe its entirety, that may be something you want to consider adding to this particular motion. Go ahead, Mayor.
Yeah, let me just reflect on that. I certainly, just in principle, would have no issue with the governance working group having that kind of latitude, just as a broad comment. Whether that would need to be put in a motion or not, but I'd like to hear comments from others as I reflect on that. But no issue with having the working group give that as part of a full consideration, as opposed to kind of the picking one item versus picking another, and that just feels a little awkward to me. That's all.
Councillor Kayabaga.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, I think I'd like to understand a little bit of what Councillor Pelosa is trying to achieve here, because we do have a specific amount for our expenses, and it's not specifically set out to be for this or for that. So are you trying to reduce our expense amount, or are you just symbolically trying to get us to say that we will not be expensing our internet, because it's in one fund? It doesn't necessarily say this is how much money you have to expense for internet, or how much money you have to expense for transportation, or different things that we expense through our expense account. It's given to us for the year, and it doesn't really, I was just trying to understand where you were going with this.
Councillor Pelosa.
Thank you, through the chair, for the question, Councillor Kayabaga. Certainly recognizing that we are capped at a certain amount of our expenses, and within that expense policy, it lays out what is or is not claimable. Certainly, home internet currently is listed as a claimable option. Just recognizing that there's no cap on internet. Is it the basic $30 a month? Is it the unlimited? You can claim, it's up to individual councillors' discretion. Just seeing that a lot of corporations no longer in the for-profit world allow it, just recognizing that a lot of people already have it. And for me personally, I wasn't claiming it. It's something I already have anyways, because the kids are always on doing their homework and whatnot. And certainly just looking that it would be reviewed of, do we cap it? Is there a special ratio, or do we just not allow it? And then that money in our policy, in our certain councillor policies, would just be allotted to other work that we do. We would just do more stuff with it.
Councillor Kayabaga.
So through you, Chair, maybe, I mean, I've looked at the expense account, the council's expense policy, and I was trying to wrap my mind around what exactly can be done in this situation, because we're given a specific amount of money to expense, and there are policies that list exactly what we can and cannot do, and I think it was reviewed with the last council, and I think it's fair. And just looking at the work that we do, internet is a necessity, and although a lot of us myself haven't been able to claim to expense internet through my expense account, I do recognize that there are people who could expense it because it is a necessity to them. So I'm just trying to understand, again, my question around how do we achieve what you're trying to achieve without, I don't understand exactly what we're trying to achieve here by specifically pointing out internet. Why are we targeting transportation? Why are we targeting different things that are an expense account that the last council approved to be deemable for councillors, looking at the work that we do and the things that we need to do our job. And I understand your concern, and just because I don't have an internet problem, you don't have an internet problem, does not mean that others won't have that internet problem. And I don't really see this as a good move to set that barrier for someone who might need it, because I even remember during the campaign, there were two mayoral candidates who mentioned that internet was not a basic thing that they have, a basic, I guess the word here was luxury. I don't think it's a luxury. There are people who genuinely cannot afford internet, and that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be able to do the work of a councilor or mayor because they don't already have internet at home. I appreciate that we have the luxury to have the internet, but it's not a luxury for everyone. Some people, it's a need that they may need to be able to do the work as a councilor. So I would be cautious around putting that barrier for someone when we've spent a lot of time trying to remove barriers for people to run for council and for people to run for office. So I'm not going to support this because I don't think that, well, number one, I don't think it's clear on what action or what we're trying to achieve here. And I also agree with Mayor Holder that this discussion could be had in the governing committee. Not here, but also I'm not going to approve it because I don't agree that we should be putting barriers just because we don't need it. For example, some of us do expense transportation, right? And I could list a list of councilors who expense transportation. So why are we targeting specifically internet? Because we don't need it, but there are other people who might need it. So I'm not going to support it because I don't want to put that barrier there. Thank you.
Just for some context from the discussions, I would just wanted to let council know the action that SPPC and council, I think council has not approved this yet? No, council hasn't approved this yet, but going to council at the next meeting is through SPPC, through the report of the governance working group, that a discussion regarding the councilor's members' expense accounts be referred to a meeting of the governance working group to be held in the first quarter of 2020. I recall at the working group, the items that Councillor Van Holst wanted us to discuss, we wanted to give colleagues, especially new colleagues, time to utilize and experience the expense account through the course of the year. And that's why we asked, or are asking for the permission of council as a working group to refer that to the first quarter of 2020. I know the clerk has arrived in the room, and I know she might be able to provide the context of the actual scope of the work that the governance working group currently has on councilor members' expense account, because while you weren't in the room, clerk, their question was asked, can the working group already deal with this matter, or does it need additional direction to deal with it? So the scope of that might help with what committee is trying to decide on this particular item.
Through Mr. Chair, the work before the governance working group is reflective of a communication from Councillor Van Holst, which was a more looking more at being less restrictive than more restrictive. If in my mind, when Councillor Pelosa asked me about this specific communication, if you're looking for something specifically to not be allowed, I felt that given the broadness of Councillor Van Holst's communication, it should be more, there should be more specific guidance. And I believe the recommendation is just to include it in that review. It's not to eliminate it, but to include it as part of the review. So I think because it was very specific, the governance working group needed more direction.
Okay, I hope that context helps for colleagues in what the current scope of the work being done is. If you have further questions, please feel free to ask through the chair to the clerk. I have Councillor Turner, I believe, next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If there are some things that council will be destined to discuss for all eternity and every term, this is one of them. Council compensation is another, and taxis are the third. So, yeah, we did the food trucks. I hope that's done. Anyway, I can appreciate the intent of the motion that Councilor Pelosa is seeking to do. The challenge is this really the right place to be focusing it? When I first read it, brought me a bit of frustration because I thought it kind of leads to us spinning our wheels. The explanation that it needs to come through here before it goes to governance working group makes sense, and that's why it's here on the agenda. I think it probably warrants a fair discussion at governance working group to figure out are there revisions in general that need to be done to the councillor expense account. That being said, in 2018, the average expense for a councillor was $7,166 of an expense account that's $15,000. So most councillors spent less than 50%. In fact, only 4 of 14 councillors on the entire council last year spent more than 50% of their budget. So I worry about items of materiality. Is this an item of materiality? The total net expense, see what I did there, of this item is really low in the expense account scheme of things. Councillor Van Holst raises the question of should we be allowed to do more with our expense account? And those are sometimes constraints that I find too. Are there things that I can do to support activities within my ward? I can't because of the way that the expense account rules are constructed. So yeah, let's take a look at it. But I think this item itself in its own right, when we take a look at what councillors are to the corporation, we're not really employees of the corporation. We're independent. And so when you look at independent contractors and the work that they do, Canada Revenue Agency allows for the deduction of expenses associated with executing duties from a home office. Internet would be an absolute allowable expense for an independent contractor. And when you take a look at the duties that we do, there's significant amount of work that we do that's associated with online presence, whether that's through communication, social media, or just even processing the thousands of pages of agendas we read from week to week. So if the intent is to say, okay, let's take a look at the council expense account and the rules around that in both the restrictive and the more permissive sense in general, then sure, I can support that. If the question is this specific item on its own, I wouldn't support that when it comes to council next week. So I hope perhaps there's some breadth and some latitude to be able to explore that a bit further.
So that's a good time for me to note that there's actually no motion on the floor because a letter from a colleague, the committee would be required to actually craft an action in whatever they feel is appropriate on this. Councillor Pelosi has outlined her case. We're continuing to discuss that. But if a committee member at an appropriate time would like to move a motion on this, I'd certainly entertain a seconder for it. I have Mayor Holder who has raised his hand.
Thank you very much. Only to reply to Councillor Turner's point, and I think he makes a fair comment with respect to the number of councillors and whatever percentage of dollars they've spent. I just don't want to get the impression, and sometimes we get this through the media, that somehow if we've spent less of our expense accounts, that we're doing a better job. I don't think that's true at all. The reason that there is an expense account there is to allow and to support councillors' work that they do. So from that standpoint, and I don't know when that was last reviewed, quite frankly, in terms of its numbers. I know certainly councillors' incomes were considered in the last council. But it strikes me that, again, to make a point, that I certainly don't want us to imagine that the lesser amount we spend, the more effective and the more prudent we are as councillors. I think those are individual choices based on whatever is going on in support of your ward or citywide, as the case may be. So I wanted to make that as a brief point, and I'm really comfortable with the first quarter of corporate governance having its latitude to do what it does. My sense is by the SPCC motion that there'd be sufficient latitude in there for council to, or the committee, the governance working committee, then to take a look at it. And I hope that would satisfy the Councillor Pelosi's intent, which I think is very thoughtful.
Well, I'd like to go to the clerk on that, because it's really important to be clear. What latitude does the governance working group have to review, given previous council direction, the expense policy? Do you feel that there are any restrictions on the scope that they can entertain in their particular review?
Through Mr. Chair, my interpretation of the direction that was given by council to the governance working group was to look at the expense accounts within the context of the communication received, which was to make it less restrictive than more restrictive. If council wishes the governance working group to look at the policy in its entirety from all perspective, and I think another motion clarifying that the governance working group is to look at it from all perspectives, whether it's less restrictive or more restrictive or in between. So the motion could be something like to do a review of the entire policy within the context of the governance working group.
Okay, so I wanted to get that clarification because it isn't as I think, expected. There's not a wide-ranging scope. It is basically specific to the types of things that Councillor Van Holst had communicated in his letter from the clerk's understanding.
So if that's the case, it would then require a motion to provide some additional flexibility to the corporate governance group to review this, the working governance group to review this. And I would not put any limitations on this. I'm very mindful about being too prescriptive as well. You heard some of those comments earlier. Because in the court of public opinion, where expenses are very public, those reviews will be will stand as they do. But I'd certainly support a motion to give the governance working group the opportunity to review this. And frankly, even with respect to the amounts. And I don't mean lowering, but in terms of just reviewing it from an appropriateness standpoint.
Okay, that sounds like a motion, and I see Councillor Hillier giving a number 2 sign beside you there. So the clerk, as you were speaking, I think has drafted some language. When she's ready, I'd like it read back so that you're okay assigning your name to it. You can make any adjustments.
Make it sound better than I said, please, Claire.
What I have drafted based on the mayor's information there is that the governance working group be directed to undertake a fulsome review of the council members' expense account policy during its review in the first quarter of 2020. That's moved by Mayor Holder and seconded by Councillor Hillier.
I have Councillor Cassidy and, sorry, actually, I gotta go to Councillor Hopkins because she was supposed to be after Councillor Turner, but I messed up my list, so I'm sorry, Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for recognizing me. And I know there's a motion on the floor, and I would encourage the committee to support that. But I'm here to speak to the motion on the agenda, which is to remove the home internet as an eligible expense. And I appreciate probably the intent of the motion to be good stewards of the taxpayers' money, but I had a hard time when I read this not to take it personally, because I do use the internet as an expense. What concerns me about the request here is that it is very restrictive, and it's basically dictating how I'm going to do my job. And that concerns me. And putting my own personal opinion and response, I think we should be very careful about restricting other people to take on an elected position. I think we all come from different backgrounds, different financial brackets, depending on our abilities, but we should all be allowed to have that accessibility and to run for elected office. And I think this is an obstacle. It can be an obstacle for some people. I also want to just make a comment. We all do our jobs differently. I think depending on our wards, the boards, the commissions that we sit on, that enables some of us to maybe put in 30 hours a week. Some of us put in 60 or even more. Again, I think we have to be very careful dictating and being mindful and respectful of each other and how we do our jobs, depending on our positions that we've taken on. to this motion, I understand we do have these iPhones. I love my iPhone. I cannot live without it. I'm not good at reading PDFs on my iPhone, though. I find that a barrier, and it concerns me. Following up on Councillor Turner's point about how we love to talk about our expense count, coming from 4 years of talking about our expense account, and I'm sure we put in a lot of time, our own time, staff's time, discussing how our expense account should be taken care of, is something that is, I don't know what it is about us, but we just love to do that. And I would just kind of just be careful when we do talk about it, that we aren't discriminating against one another. I think that's something that we have to do it in a very respectful way. Again, I think it's going to be a long 4 years of talking about our expense account. I'm here talking about it. And I do recognize Councillor Pelosa, her intent, I'm sure, is that to probably remind us all to be careful of how we use the taxpayers' money. And so for that, I think is worthwhile to be a reminder to all of us.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for recognizing me again. Yeah, I wanted to bring up something that newer councillors may not know. And the fact of the matter is, previous council, near the beginning of our term, did open up the expense account for review. We made it very restrictive compared to prior years. Hence, Councillor Van Holst seeking to change it up a bit. In previous years, if my car broke down, I could get it fixed and expense those repairs as an eligible expense. We took things like that away. We made a much more direct tie between the expense, what's eligible, and our job. What our job is in a broad sense. And a big part of the job is setting up a home office. And high-speed internet is essential to setting up an effective home office. I take exception also to the fact that everybody has home internet. It's just a given. 87% according to Councillor Pelosa's letter. So that means 13% do not. And again, it goes back to those barriers. What's the poverty rate in London? 17% of Londoners live below the LICO measure in the City of London. Are we setting up barriers to people so that they can't do their job effectively? And I believe home internet is absolutely essential to be able to do your job effectively. I have used hotspotting before. There, at one point, my corporate laptop was not connecting to the internet properly, so I hotspotted from my phone. It's not an effective way to on an ongoing basis, to do this work. I agree with Councillor Hopkins. Reading a 600-page planning committee report on my phone is not easy. And again, there are barriers there around age. My eyes at 53 are not the same as your eyes in your early 40s, Mr. Chair, or someone else's eyes in their 20s or 30s. It's not the same. I've been very conscious. I've tried throughout the 4 and a bit years that I've been on council to not tell any other councillor how they should do their job, to not comment on how another councillor chooses to do the job of serving their constituents. The job that I do serving Ward 5 is very different from the job of the councillor from Ward 4 serving his constituents. And I believe the mayor put it very well in that we shouldn't be in a contest to be at the lowest in spending from our expense account. We should spend it wisely. We should use it wisely to ensure that we are serving our our constituents and the citizens of London and the residents of London very well. If we were to use the $1750 amount that was expensed last year on home internet, we oversee a $1 billion budget. That's 0.0000175%. And if we go to the higher amount, the 4,000, it's 0.0000004%. We've probably spent more money talking about this in staff time, preparing reports. I'm not against examining the expense account if we want to continue to submit ourselves to this kind of self-abuse, then that's fine. It doesn't hurt to monitor the expense policy on an ongoing basis to make sure we are following best practices and that we have a policy that allows us to serve the residents of the City of London. I cannot say that I look forward to having this discussion again because I know we will.
Thank you, Councillor Cassidy. It's actually the members of the governance working group we'd be subjecting to the discussion initially, but it'll come back for everybody, don't worry. There is a clarification I wanted to make, and I'm going to ask the clerk to do it, because there's been some discussion about the home internet expense being enveloped within the $15,000 expense account. I believe that is an expense that can be incurred actually on top of that, the way that I've seen them reported out. So I wonder if the clerk can confirm that. I assume that the scope would be related, but sorry, the deputy clerk can confirm that.
Thank you. Through the chair. In previous terms, home internet claims were made through a separate account, but in this term of council, they've been moved back into the expense account, so it would be included within that 15,000.
Perfect. Great clarification. I have Councillor Van Holst and then Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to Councillor Pelosi. She did the right thing. She wanted to bring something forward for consideration at the governance working group, and this is the way to do it. So, and unfortunately, I think the debate that she'd hoped would happen there was happening here. Maybe this sort of a recommendation should be non-debatable, and then we could just get it off to that committee for debate. But the idea of having things that we don't expense was entertained in that motion. So right now we have a list of expenses, things we can do, and it's very restrictive. And the suggestion I wanted us to look at was a list of things that we can't do. And so that leaves some leeway. However, Councillor Pelosi's suggestion could be one of those things if we decided that we didn't do, and it would fall into that category. So it could certainly be something that's discussed there. However, I think the mayor's suggestion that we look at this even in a more fulsome way will work out just fine. So I encourage you to support the mayor's motion, which will take into account Councillor Pelosi's request as well.
So, and on that, just as chair, and for those who might be following at home, the current motion on the floor that I need to check with the mayor and Councillor Hillier that they're okay with the language on is that the governance working group be directed to undertake a fulsome review of the annual council member expense account policy during its review in the first quarter of 2020. I anticipate that means starting in 2020. It being noted that the Corporate Services Committee received a communication dated April 4th, 2019 from Councillor E. Pelosi with respect to this matter. I just want to confirm that the mover and seconder are okay with that language.
Chair, you are so darn close. The thing that if I didn't clarify, that I would have added or liked to have added, but certainly said in my comments, has to do with, in that fulsome review, includes not just the policy, but the amount for the budget as part of the consideration as well. So the councillor's expense budget.
Oh, so
I'm
also the
looking
amount.
looking for a complete review is what I'm looking for. It may remain the same. It's not
Okay,
for me
so not
to
just a policy
prejudge.
review, but a review of the amount. We'll get that language changed if the councillor who seconded it is okay with that Councillor Hill, yeah, I see nodding. I have Councillor Helmer first, and then I'll go to you next.
I'm going to try and keep it tight. First, I want to say a thank you to Councillor Pelosa. When I first saw the communication, I was not happy. That's primarily because I have gone through several rounds of discussions around the expense policy, and I frankly just do not want to get into it again at all. It's one of the reasons I didn't step forward to be on the governance working group. Again, despite the fact that I actually like a lot of the things that the governance working group talks about. And I think I'm going to get dragged in there kind of unwillingly. But that all being said, despite the fact that my initial reaction was kind of annoyance, I want to recognize that, you know, Councillor Pelosa has not gone through all these debates about the expense policy. And as Councillor Van Holst just pointed out, this is a perfectly normal and reasonable thing to do, which is to say, I don't think this is the right policy. We should change it. Like, I mean, so I got over my initial reaction very quickly, I would say. It has resurfaced a little bit in the discussion so far at committee. I think we need to think about how often we engage in discussions around this particular topic, because it is something that I think everyone has opinions on. It's one of the reasons why the discussions can go for so long. It's kind of a values discussion. The amounts of money that we're talking about are very small. You know, earlier today we talked about the end of year budget reports, hundreds of millions of dollars, many major decisions happening in those reports. And the amount of time that we've spent talking about this part is sort of grossly out of proportion to the amount of time we spent talking about all the big money. And that's just the nature of the issue, right? It's an issue that is very easy to get your head around, and people have a lot of opinions, and they basically coming from their values. You know, that's all I'm going to say about, in general about that topic. I want to flag, however, that the policy, I think, is the issuance of a computer equipment and office equipment policy that actually has this thing about home internet in it. And so, yeah, so you're going to want to include that if you're going to look at this issue, because it says, hey, you can do this. It's part of your allocation as office, an annual stipend, and as a reference to the council expense policies. They're kind of linked. I just want to flag that if you're going to actually deal with the issue. You probably want to include it. I think I will support the motion from the mayor. I like the fact that the governance working group has decided to put off the discussion to a certain point. I think that's very wise to let everyone have the experience of going through how it is now and then make up their minds. I think that's appropriate. So I'm not going to comment on the actual idea at all. I don't, other than to say I don't claim it, but I think it is necessary. I have the luxury of not having to claim it.
Thank you, Councillor Helmer. We also had a discussion not just about delaying it, but actually engaging with members on their use too when we do that review. So we would be reaching out to everybody as part of that process. So you see the adjusted language to the motion now on the screen, Mayor and Councillor Hillier. I hope you're okay with that. If so, I'll seek any other questions or comments. I do have Councillor Kayabaga next, and I'll continue the list if others want to speak. You're good with this? Yeah?
I'm comfortable with that, Chair.
Okay, great. Councillor Kayabaga.
I just have a question. Since I'm in full support with the mayor's motion, and since we're talking about looking at a full sum of the expense account, do we have to specifically look at internet specifically, or we're just going to look at the whole global thing? Can we just be very broad in the language and not be specific?
Yeah, so that's what the motion says. The only reason it references basically references Councillor Pelosa's communication, because we should actually deal with that as a committee. We recognize that the councillor has written something. And so certainly what she's brought forward would be considered in this, as well as anything else. And through the engagement with councillors, I would anticipate that other issues would arise for the working group's review. No further comments? Okay, we'll open this one for voting.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0.
Thank you, Councillor Pelosi, for writing a letter to our committee. I mean that. The next thing we have on the agenda is deferred matters, additional business. We have one item under there, that is the Corporate Services Committee deferred matters list. There's one item on the list. Councillor Helmer. It's been moved. I need a seconder. It's Councillor Kayabага. Any discussion on the deferred matters list? I don't see any. I didn't even look that way. All those in favor? Or we'll put it up on the screen.
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0.
Committee members, is there any other matters of additional business? Okay, seeing none. We have a 8-item in-camera agenda. It will probably take some time to get through. We have no other public business, so my intent is to entertain a motion to move into closed session. We will end closed session from the committee room, open the doors, see if anybody's there, and then adjourn publicly from that room. So we won't be coming back here, so you can log off. I need a motion to move into closed session. Councillor Van Meerbergen, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer. We'll vote on that on the screen.
How about yes?
Councillor Van Meerbergen?
Once again, I don't have
Closing the vote, the motion's passed 6-0.